Well, I had the video working fine this morning for Sunday school, and I forgot to turn on the sound entirely. So, seeing how video without sound is not much use, I'm just redoing the whole thing back here in my office again. Today was our first day at the new church in Fields Landing, our first building, and so everything was a little bit disorganized and discombobulated, and I just couldn't remember to turn it on. So, last week, we started with Genesis 12, verses 4 through 6. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. So in Acts 7, God told us that Abram's first calling was to leave his hometown. Now, God has spoken with Abram again after his father died, and twice it says that Lot went with him. I'm pretty sure that Abram has sort of adopted Lot, but not as a son, but as a brother, interestingly enough. And we'll talk about why that is. Another implication, though, in the verses here is that Abram got a lot more rich while he was in Haran. Note it says he took all of his family and all their possessions that they had gathered and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. Now, this can be taken badly. Some people want to claim that Abram bought lots of slaves and dragged them away in his caravan. But slavery as practiced by the Jews is completely different than slavery as practiced by America and Britain in recent centuries. We would call their form of slavery more indentured servitude. If your family had big debts and you had no way to pay them, you could ask a rich family to pay your debts for you in exchange for years of service and certain kinds of work. And then you would work for them for the contracted number of years. So if after your contract expired, you liked the people you worked for and wanted to continue working with them, you could renew your contract, or you could promise to be a lifelong servant to this family, and they would pierce your ear as a symbol that you would remain with them forever, as a voluntary servant. So we talked a lot about his servant, Abram's servant named Eliezer. Now in Genesis 15, 2 through 4, Abram tells God that he's still waiting for a son, and right now my heir is Eliezer of Damascus. Now his name means help from God. We know that because in Exodus 18:4, Moses named his second son Eliezer, and it meant help from God. Now, it's likely, though, that Eliezer of Damascus got his name long after he started working for Abram. We assume that because this is kind of a godly name, and when you worship the moon god, as Abram and Terah did, you probably didn't give a lot of godly names. You gave God names. So anyway, it's likely that Eliezer got this name or his name changed once Abram became a believer. Now, it does say that Eliezer was born in Abram's house. A lot of people assume that that means literally that Eliezer's mother brought him out of the womb in Abraham's tent. But I do not believe that's what it means. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And here's why it's unlikely. We looked at Genesis chapter 17, where Abram is told by God to do circumcision as a sign of the covenant. And basically what happens in Genesis 17 is God commands Abram to get circumcised, and all the men who are related to him to get circumcised, and everyone who is born in your house, and everyone who is bought with your money. It seems, therefore, that there is a distinction between Abram, between his relatives, like Lot, and between his servants. And you notice that it's he who is born in his house and he who is bought with your money are paired in the same sentence, implying that there are some who are adopted into the house and there are some who are bought and are only temporarily in the house. And we also looked at Genesis 14, when Abram took 318 male servants born in his house who were taught to fight to attack the armies that captured Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot. Well, imagine 318 boys born in your house, literally on your 10th floor. And where did all these 318 guys come from? Have they been with him forever? I don't believe so. I believe he bought them or bought their services in Haran before he left. So I really doubt that born in your house means the way we mean it, born in your house. It means you were adopted into the house. At least that's my view and the view of many others. But we also looked at Eliezer and his amazing loyalty to Abram. First of all, he was willing to be circumcised along with all the other guys, which is no small sacrifice, you might say. But also in Genesis chapter 24, Abram asks his servant Eliezer to go do him a big favor and go and find a good wife for his son Isaac. He doesn't want a Canaanite wife, a wicked wife. He wants a good wife from his own relatives in his own household, so to speak. So Eliezer goes to find some relatives, and he finds Laban, which is the son of one of Abram's brothers. And Laban's sister is Rebekah. And so Eliezer prays when he arrives, or before he arrives, God, help me find a good wife for Isaac, for the sake of my servant Abraham. And then when Rebekah shows herself to be such a person, then Eliezer worships God and praises him and thanks him for finding a good wife for Abram's son. So Eliezer is really loyal because you recognize that Eliezer was the heir. Until Ishmael and then Isaac was born, Eliezer was going to take over the whole place if Abram died. And so that shows a lot of loyalty and love to give up your own ambitions. Instead of being the richest guy in Canaan, you still remain a servant, and you're going to go find one of your competitors, Isaac, a wife so he can have more male heirs. That's a lot of loyalty. Now, many people have wondered, why didn't Abram name Lot to be his heir? He's taken Lot under his wing, and Lot's following him around everywhere. So why couldn't Lot be his heir? Well, some people speculate that maybe Lot was already known to be very selfish, and maybe Abram didn't want him inheriting. It's possible, but I doubt that. You see, the tradition in ancient Semitic families was that the owner of the house had to have a non-family member inheritor ready as a backup plan. So what that means is if Abram and Isaac and Ishmael are all killed in a battle or in a disease or whatever, he wants to have someone else able to take over the family so the family doesn't self-destruct and break apart. And so Eliezer is still in the heir line just in case. Now, here's the problem with naming Lot. The purpose of naming an heir is that that heir will also have an heir. And Lot, if you remember, Lot did not have any sons. When we get to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, you remember the angels drag Lot out, and who do they take with Lot? His wife and his 2 daughters. The sons-in-law didn't come. Their husbands didn't come with them. They didn't believe him. So Lot had no boys, and therefore, if Abram made Lot the heir, it's just passing the buck to another generation that still doesn't have an heir. So Eliezer probably had sons of his own, and therefore could have been a more long-term heir. So we don't know how Abram got richer in Haran. God simply blessed Abram in everything he did. But as for the people he acquired in Haran, he definitely picked up a lot more servants, and I propose that most or all of those new servants were soldiers. Why? Because it appears that when God called Abram out of Haran, he told him to go southwest, and that meant Canaan. And Canaan, as I told you, was a lawless, wicked land, a dangerous place, run by local warlords and small towns and cities. And so if you're going to a dangerous place with your large family, you want protection. So what I believe happened is that Abram bought or acquired the services of at least 300 soldiers. It says young men who they brought into the family and trained to fight. So they will be the protectors. It's like a small military force. So then we looked at Genesis 12, 6 through 9. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. It sounds like God drops in on Abram whenever Abram needs direction or a comforting word. And so every time God tells Abram to go somewhere, he goes. And then once he's there, Abram sets up another altar, and God tells him again where to go. Abram is learning to rely on God day by day or week by week and follow his instructions. At one point, Abram is on top of a tall hill looking west at the land of Canaan and east to the land of Sodom and Gomorrah and the Jordan River. And God says to him, all of this is going to belong to your descendants. So God reminds Abram of the covenant, and now Abram can see it with his own eyes. He sees the land that they will inherit, but they have not. So far, he doesn't own any of it. So Abram built an altar there. Then it says, Abram's caravan continued south, and he built another altar and called on God. So why did God send Abraham south, or Abram, and how did Abram react to danger? Genesis 12:10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. So now we're sort of leaving the review to some degree and starting up on today's lesson. I told you a few weeks ago that after the flood, it took the earth about 1,000 years to get back to normal, meaning there are still volcanic eruptions, there are still earthquakes, there's huge unpredictable storms, tornadoes, hurricanes. The weather is a mess. Things are still changing as the oceans mediate their temperatures or moderate. And apparently at this point, Canaan is in a drought and a famine. And for Abram, that's a big problem because Abram owns no land, which means he has no crops. They are basically hunter-gatherers, and there's 1,000 of them. It's kind of hard to feed 1,000 hunter-gatherers, especially in a drought. So Abram is reliant on food from other places. And the only place now with food is Egypt. And Egypt, although it is a somewhat dangerous place, it's a better place to go than Nineveh, perhaps. Nineveh was probably more wicked and more dangerous. So that's why he continued south and went into Egypt. Now, he relies on Egypt because he has no other choice. But you need to understand that the children of Ham, who run Egypt, was fairly orderly. Egypt, at this point, is not an empire. It is a growing nation state, has a lot of power, a lot of money, but they are not yet expanding and trying to take over other lands. So they're not particularly hostile. And it appears that during the famine, they're somewhat welcoming of foreigners. At least if you come with money, they're happy to sell you food for money. And why is Egypt have food? Because of the Nile River. The Nile River is one of the biggest rivers in the world. I don't know whether it's ever been completely dry. I kind of doubt it. It gets water from the highlands of East Africa, and it flows north toward the Mediterranean Sea through Sudan and Egypt. So Egypt always has a water supply, which means that it can always have cropland, and that's why they have food. And you'll see that situation arise again in the time of Joseph, 100 years later. So now let's start Genesis 12, verses 11 through 13. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen, when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." Well, you see here that Abram has some character traits that are not good. All of us do, though hopefully we grow out of them to a degree through the power of Christ and the Holy Spirit. But what's obvious here is that Abram is afraid of being murdered by the Egyptians. And so he is willing to lie, and he asks his wife to lie to reduce his fear of death. So today we will spend a lot of time talking about the sin of lying. But first, let's take a more physical question that many people have asked. If Abram is now 75 years old and Sarai is 65 years old, how is it that she could be so beautiful that people would murder to steal her. I mean, that's a pretty good-looking lady if you're willing to kill somebody together. This question is even more apropos when you come to the later time when Sarah is 89 and Abram lies about her again. Although that time he doesn't call her lovely. There may have been other things involved that time. But in this time, she's so beautiful, the Pharaoh might be willing to kill Abram to get her, is Abram's fear. Well, the answer to this question really isn't so hard if you think about the situation. For example, at this time, people are living 200 years. Abram himself will live 175. Now, Sarah's only going to live to 127, but she doesn't know that, and she seems to die kind of young. So, for all intents and purposes, Sarai is not yet even middle age. I mean, if you live 200 years, then our equivalent to 50 would be, what would that be to her? Oh, I'm all confused at any rate. But here, look at it this way. The average lifespan of an American woman is something like 80. In comparison, Sarah is now 65. But since she will live 3 times longer, she's more like 30 in our years. And there's still a lot of pretty ladies at age 30. There's even pretty ladies at 40 and 50. Now, another factor is to consider that who is looking at her to decide that she's so beautiful. Abram, 75, he looks at her, sure, she's gorgeous. Well, the Pharaoh of Egypt, for all we know, he could be 175. And if you're 175, some 65-year-old woman is a spring chicken. Also, consider the fact that Sarai has not had any children. I noticed a lot of comments online from ladies who said, well, no wonder she looked young. She hasn't had any children yet. And I guess having children does take a toll on your beauty and figure, perhaps. So all of these things, if you think about them all together, you can still be pretty at her age, and she's a lot younger than compared to us because she lives to be 130. She could have lived to be 200. So at any rate, being 65 wasn't all that old back then. So now we'll go back to the problem of Abram the liar. This was a family trait among the children of Terah. His grandchildren, Laban and Rebekah, are master liars and manipulators. Even Sarah is a liar. If you remember the story, when Jesus and the 2 angels come to visit Abram, they promise him he will have a son through Sarah. Sarah laughs. And Jesus says, why does Sarah laugh? And Sarah says, oh, no, I didn't laugh. He says, yeah, you did. I heard you laugh. So she's lying to cover up her laughter. So apparently even Sarah's in on this lying thing. And Abram is apparently a habitual liar. He does it at least twice in the Bible. So the truth is, though, that all humans have a problem with lies, and that's because we are all born in sin. And we are born minions of Satan. And Satan was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. Lies and anger come naturally to people. It's not rare. In fact, what's rare is for honesty and calmness to be in natural people. And with Terah's background, family background in idolatry, it's even a more serious problem. We look at Romans chapter 1. The Apostle Paul shows where these problems come from in Romans 1, verses 20 to 23. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image like corruptible man, and birds and 4-footed animals and creeping things. So according to Paul, idolaters, you become an idolater as part of the process of you rejecting God. You've rejected God. You now find it easier to worship lesser gods. Of course, it's much easier to worship a stone or a rock or a piece of wood because they're not really going to harm you, are they? So, but then once you become an idolater, Paul says that the next step is that you become a wicked Canaanite. You completely release all of your morality and become homosexual or perverted. The good news for a family of Terah, and Abram at least, is they only went halfway toward evil. They didn't go the full Canaanite way. You could call the Canaanites the absolute perverts, and you could call the moon worshippers like Terah half perverts. Well, great. you're still a wicked sinner and you're still going to hell just because you're half as bad as the other guys. So just consider that Abram's family was not good, and they showed that in idolatry. And so lying is just, it's just a part of being an idolater. And unfortunately, it's something Abram apparently never shook. It's his besetting sin for the rest of his life. However, for this reason, we want to consider the possibility that Abram is not even a believer yet. There are, in fact, many preachers and commentators who teach that Abram did not become a Christian or a believer until Genesis 15:6. And here's why. We'll read Genesis 15:6. And he believed in the Lord, and he, that's God, accounted it to him for righteousness. The way you can take that verse, you can, and these people do, they take it to say that now Abram believed in faith, and so now God accounts him as righteous. That's how they're applying Genesis 15:6. And there are also two New Testament passages that they cite in conjunction with this to try to prove that point. So we'll start by looking at Galatians 3, verses 5 through 9. Words of Paul in Galatians 3, 5 through 9. Therefore, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith? Just as Abram believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Therefore know that only those who are of faith are sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel to Abram beforehand, saying, in you all the nations shall be blessed. So those who are of faith are blessed with believing Abraham. Now the most important point of these verses is to say that Abram's sons are not sons by genetics. They're not sons of Abram just because they were born to Abram or from his line. They're sons of Abram because they have faith. And thus it's the sons of faith who are the children of Abram and not the Jewish people alone, per se. And notice also in this passage, it quotes Genesis 12, and it calls it the preaching of the gospel to Abram beforehand. So the Genesis 12 promise was the preaching of the gospel to Abraham. Abram heard the gospel in Genesis 12. Now, how then does that square with your idea that Abram is not a believer until Genesis 15? You have to say then that Abram heard the gospel and still rejects it, and he doesn't really accept it until Genesis 15. So let's look at another passage that they often quote, which is in Romans 4. Romans 4, verses 1 through 5. What then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. What does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness. So once again, Paul cites Genesis 15 as proof that faith is accounted as righteousness in Abraham. I don't deny that at all. No doubt, it is faith that is the mechanism that God uses for our salvation. Our hearts are changed by the Holy Spirit, they're regenerated, and then we reach out in faith to take the promise of God offered. So the faith of Abram and our own faith is the same exact faith. It's the same action. The question is, does Genesis 15:6 prove that Abram didn't become a believer until that point? And do these passages of Paul imply that Abram first became a believer at that moment and not earlier? Why even worry about this? Well, it's a kind of important question. For the main reason is this. Are you saying that everything Abram did in chapters 11 through 14 was still evil? He left his homeland and that was evil. He left Haran and that was evil. He rescued his brother or nephew Lot from the Canaanite armies and that was evil. All that was evil? That doesn't seem right to me. Also, in Genesis chapter 12, God called him and promised to give him blessings. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. I'm going to make you a great nation. So you're telling me that God told a wicked, unbelieving liar, moon worshiper, hey, I'm going to bless you. It doesn't matter to me. You don't really believe me yet, but hey, you deserve to be worshiped or to be blessed. And so I'm going to curse anybody who bothers you. That's bizarre. Why would God make that kind of a promise to a wicked man? He wouldn't. So there's no way the Genesis 12 calling can match the idea that Abram is still wicked until Genesis 15:6. And the most obvious, here's another linguistic reason to disbelieve that version. Linguistically, in Genesis 15:6, it's believed that that verb for believed is not a past perfect, a simple past, I should say. A simple past verb would mean sometime recently Abram in the past believed, and now God accounts it to him for righteousness because of that past work. Okay, that's the normal, that's how they're interpreting that verb. But many say that this is called an imperfect past, which means Abram continued to believe or kept on believing. In other words, he was believing before and he's still believing. So it's called a frequentative form. It's a repeated verb. He kept on believing. This would imply then that his Genesis 15 belief is not just brand new faith, it's just a continuing faith upon his old faith. So secondly, let's look at Abram's apparent earlier acts of faith, because there's about 10 years between Genesis 12 and Genesis 15. You'd have to say that God was making amazing promises of blessings and cursings for Abraham's friends and foes, even though Abram wasn't a believer. That seems rather off. Furthermore, in today's text, we'll be looking at Abram lying and God punishing Pharaoh for taking his wife. So you're saying that God is punishing the Pharaoh for stealing Abram's wife, even though Abram is a wicked man, a liar, and God doesn't love him yet because he's still a wicked man and a liar and has no faith. Why would God punish one wicked man and bless the other wicked man? See, it just doesn't make any sense. Then also in Genesis 14, when Abram and his men save Lot from the invading kings, a guy named Melchizedek shows up, a high priest, it says. Now, there's a lot of argument about who Melchizedek is. I tend to believe that he was the incarnate Son of God, because Hebrews says he had no father and no mother. But at the very least, whoever he is, this high priest, Melchizedek says to Abram, blessed be Abram of God Most High. Okay, now, would a true priest or Jesus Christ himself say that Abram was blessed by God Most High if he wasn't even a believer? I don't think so. But the final proof, if none of this argumentation means much to you, the final proof is Hebrews 11:8. We looked at it last week, but we'll look at it again. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would inherit, which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise. So Hebrews 11 is the final word. It says that by faith, Abram left his homeland and went to a new place. And when did that happen? Genesis 12. So how in the world can you say that Abram wasn't saved at Genesis 15, until Genesis 15? You're just out in the woods. So forget that. All of this to say, unfortunately, means that Abram the liar was a saved person while he lied. And that really shouldn't be a big surprise. How many of you have sinned since you were saved? I have, many times. And if any of you say you haven't, you're lying. 1 John tells us that if you say you're not sinning, you're a liar. Okay, so don't lie and say you're not lying. I suspect that lying is one of our chief sins. If it wasn't, James wouldn't make such a big deal about it, talking about the great evil of the tongue. It's one of our main enemies, is our tongues. So why do we lie? You lie when you're an unbeliever because it's just natural. You're a child of Satan and he loves to lie too. But when you're a Christian, why do you lie? Well, there's a very helpful article on the Gospel Coalition webpage. It's called Why Do We Lie? It's by Ryan Reeves in 2017. And many of his statistics are from a 2017 survey by National Geographic magazine. It's interesting, I didn't know that they did surveys, but apparently they did a study. And in the study, they found that about 8% of people are compulsive liars. So they're in a mental disorder. Almost everything they say is a lie. But that's a fairly small percentage. It's higher than I'd expect, but 8%. I guess most of them are in Washington, D.C. But anyway, about 75%, though, of lies are done to protect ourselves or to get something we want. In other words, we're selfish. We lie because we're selfish. We either get something by lying or we avoid something by lying. Either way, it means we care more about ourselves than about other people. That's selfishness. Now, Abram's lie is also very selfish. He asks Sarai to lie to protect his own life. And it's interesting, he even admits this, and I'm sure Sarai noticed this. If they see you and how beautiful you are, and I'm your husband, they're going to kill you and keep you alive. Now, if you think about that, why would they keep her alive? To basically make her a sex slave. She's going to join the Pharaoh's harem. Okay, so great, thanks, hubby. You don't want to die, but it's okay if I get sent into a life of sexual slavery. Great. Maybe the Egyptian rulers from the sons of Ham already have a reputation for having large harems. That's implied in the later verses. Multiple wives were not uncommon in the ancient world, but for most Jews, they might have 1 or 2 or 3 wives, whereas kings often had many, as Solomon would later prove. But so far, Abram has only 1 wife. Now, believe it or not, I'm amazed at this, but some people try to justify and say that Abram was not lying. It's true that Sarai was his sister, so technically he wasn't lying, is what they say. Well, technically is not good enough, is it? I wasn't completely lying, I was only half lying. Well, that's wrong. When you use a literal truth to purposely create a misconception, that is still a lie, especially in this kind of a context. I mean, we're not talking about something unimportant. Let's say you're crossing the border and a customs guy asks you if you have any produce, and you say no produce. You've really got an apple or something, but you just don't want to bother mentioning it. It'll cause trouble. Maybe that's a little lie. This isn't a little lie, because what are the results of this lie? Let's look at the results. Genesis 12, verses 14 through 16. So it was, when Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh. So the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He got sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. So Abram's lie has helped the Pharaoh to steal his own wife, because he said, she's my sister. And they gave Abram lots of goodies for her, sheep and oxen and donkeys and servants and camels. So suddenly, Abram is a hugely rich man, but now he has no wife. Now this is a problem, if you remember. Even if he didn't like Sarai, he kind of needed her. Why? Because God promised that they were going to produce a great nation. And it's kind of hard to have kids without a wife. So Abram's lie has cost him his wife and his integrity. And he's also caused the Pharaoh to sin by deception. Pharaoh has unintentionally stolen a married woman because Abraham lied. Now, would he have killed Abram if he knew Abram was the husband? Maybe. Maybe not. We don't know. He never got a chance to prove his righteousness. In fact, in an amazing twist of irony, it's the wicked Abraham who brings all the sin to Egypt, and it's the righteous Egyptians who give Sarah back and get rid of him. That's ridiculous, isn't it? That shows the ridiculousness of our sins. So how does this story end? Verses 17 through 20. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go away." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Now, I agree that there are times when a lie is necessary. The classic example is Nazi Germany. The Gestapo's beating on your door. You've got Jews hidden in your closet. Can you lie and say there's no Jews here? Yes, of course you can, because you're saving someone's life to do it from imminent danger. But Abram's life was not in imminent danger. He guessed that maybe he would be in danger. That's not an imminent danger. It's a possible danger. He didn't trust God. And his lie, not only did it supposedly protect himself, he endangered his own wife. His own wife is now going to be a sex slave to the Pharaoh unless she gives him back. And it might even endanger the Pharaoh because all of these plagues start falling on Egypt because of this crime. So Abram has really messed everything up here. Everything is a mess because he lies. Now, one interesting question is, how did the Pharaoh know that Sarai is his wife now? Because he calls Abram in and he already knows this. How does he know? My guess is this, that the plagues on his house were all in her area. Or some workers noticed that the day Sarai arrived, all these horrible things started happening. So my guess is that then Pharaoh called her in and said, what is going on? Why am I having all this trouble? Because ever since you got here. And I'm guessing then she broke down and told him the truth. But another thing to learn here is that Abram has very little faith in some ways. And this is true of all believers, I suspect. We are faithful in some ways. We understand God's will in some ways, and we obey in some ways. But there are some ways we don't. And Abram proves this. It seems this is the way it works with Abram. As long as God tells Abram what to do, he does it. He obeys it. But now that he's in Egypt and God hasn't told him what to do lately, Abram falls back on his own devices and starts his old life again, which is scheming. Apparently his life as an idolater was a life of lies and scheming. And so he reverts to normal when he doesn't know what God wants from him and starts lying and scheming again. But think about how faithless his scheming is. If he had thought about it, he would know that this is ridiculous, what he's doing. Okay, so here's God's promise. God promises that Abram will become a great nation. He's going to have lots of kids. Abram now goes to Egypt, and he's afraid he's going to die. He's afraid the Pharaoh's going to kill him. How can the Pharaoh kill Abram if he isn't a great nation yet? God will have lied. So Abram doesn't believe God in every way. Apparently, he's forgotten it at this point. So Abram is just a mess, and that's what we all are when we're sinful. It's also funny or interesting to me that Pharaoh didn't take his gifts back. I mean, if this guy lied to you and caused all this trouble in your country, wouldn't you want your camels and servants and donkeys back? But probably Pharaoh was just afraid of offending this angry God any further and just got rid of him without any more questions. This is also, by the way, an interesting parallel to the later Exodus from Egypt. When the evil Pharaoh sends Moses and the Jews away 450 years later, the people were giving them gifts to go. Please go, get out of here. We just don't want you around anymore. You've been a curse to us. So it's exactly the same thing that happens later. But the saddest of all in this story is that this incident does not cure Abram of his lying problem. He's going to pull the same trick 25 years later with another king. This time it won't be because she's so beautiful. It might have some other reason. But worse, the lying problem of Abram and Sarai comes to infect their whole household. Ishmael is a liar. Isaac is a liar. Jacob becomes a liar. And all of his sons become liars except for Joseph. This is what you call a family sin or a generational sin. Even if you never tell your children what your sin is, somehow they know. It's infectious. It's contagious. If you justify your own sins in your own mind, then your children can also learn to justify their own sins in their minds. It's a great danger in families. It often shows itself, the sins of the father often show itself in things like alcoholism, drug use, physical abuse, and things of that nature. And in Abram's family, he taught his generations to lie. So, Abram was definitely not a perfect, godly man, but then again, neither are we. That's the end of today's lesson, and we'll continue next week in Genesis chapter 13.